Welcome to another episode of Off the Menu. I'm your host, Vincent Franchini from Tumblr House, here with a hypnotic Charles Coulombe.
Hypnotic. Do you mean as in hypnotizing or in hypnotized? Which is it?
Both.
Ooh, hypnotic and hypnotized.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Look into my eyes. Gaze deep into my eyes. You know, I remember in the movie Ed Wood by Tim Burton about that great filmmaker and friend of my family. I remember the advice that Martin Landau, playing Bela Lugosi, gave Ed, played by Johnny Depp, as to how to hypnotize. He said, "You must be Hungarian, and you must be double jointed." So, at any rate, well, I don't know. I'm hypnotic. Well, okay, that's great. I don't know. I once had a friend say to me that I wasn't actually a friend. I was an addiction.
Ouch.
Which I was trying to figure out if that was a compliment or not. And another friend said that I have a different circle of friends for every mood swing.
I like that one.
Well, I don't know how true any of them are, but we never know ourselves, ladies and gentlemen. And as I remarked to Vinny earlier, just a minute or so before the show, you folks are all able to go home. I'm stuck with me.
Yeah, I close with more Charles Coulombe than you can possibly handle.
And I said, it's more than I can handle. The fact is, you see, ladies and gentlemen, we didn't just do the pre-show this time. We did a special movie cinematic thing.
Yeah, an hour and 10-minute movie patron-only episode, and then the patron episode. We've done about 2 hours worth of stuff, and poor Charles talking that whole time. I just asked the questions.
And I've got to pretend I know something. I mean, let me rephrase. Well, I meant, oh, never mind. But nevertheless, we're doing this, and do you know why we're able to do it?
Because of the patrons, right?
Well, yes, they made it financially possible. That's true. But the reason why we've got the stamina to continue.
I don't know.
Lammas Day magic.
Of course. Gosh, I should have known that.
You should have known that. Lammas Day magic. That's what's keeping us going right now, and not much else. Oh, gosh.
Tell us about Lammas Day, Charles.
Well, today is Lammas Day.
What is that, though?
Oh, funny you should ask. It's a day. It's the 1st of August, in fact. The Feast of St. Peter in Chains. And although since 1960, John the 23rd, as we mentioned before, didn't like what he considered repetitive holidays. So he cleared a lot of them off, and this was one of them. But it commemorates the liberation of St. Peter by the angel and the chains you can see today in Rome at the church called St. Peter in Chains. But at any rate, it was traditionally in England, because it's very much an Anglo-Saxon thing. All of our names that end in Mass are, Christmas, Childermas, Candlemas, Martinmas, Michaelmas, Lammas. And it all means the Christ Mass, Candle Mass, Michael Mass, Martin Mass. Well, Lammas does not mean Lamb's Mass, as a lot of people think. It actually means loaf mass. The reason being that this is, in England, the beginning of the wheat harvest. And so in places where they were harvesting wheat, they would take the first grains harvested, make a loaf of bread out of them, and then bring it to the Mass of St. Peter in Chains to be blessed by the priest. And that was the loaf Mass as a result. So it was considered a way of ensuring that it would be a good harvest. And that, remember, a lot of things can happen to harvests. I mean, it's not just the fact that the plants are grown. If you've got unexpected frosts, or storms, or bugs, or any sort of problems that can come up, the amount of wheat you harvest can be affected. But also, so this is the beginning then of the series of sort of harvest festivals that go on. Remember that in old Europe, as things were harvested, not everything came due at once. Some grains are earlier, some vegetables and grains are later. So the harvest was kind of scattered, basically from now into November, when the grape harvest would occur around Martinmas, which is why St. Martin is considered the patron of vintners. But so basically, the 1st of August is the beginning of the harvest season. And as it goes on, the weather gets cooler and more pleasant, more enjoyable, and more fun, and better, and more pleasant, and nicer. I prefer the autumn. You may not have picked up on that, but it's true.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that was Lammas. And of course, like so many of these festivals, Lammas Eve was considered to be a magical time, like Halloween or St. John's Eve or May Eve. August Eve was another name for it. So there'd be, ghost stories and witches and elves and so on and so forth.
How come the eves are always magical?
Because it's harder to get away with magic in the daylight.
But I mean, it's just the day before.
It's the day before. Well, the idea being that a holy feast in itself is not a time when things like that would be likely to walk, but the time just before.
Interesting.
And, even today around Halloween, you'll hear the phrase, "This is a time when the veil between the worlds is very thin." And that's become almost a cliche today.
Yeah. What did that originate from?
I really don't know. Maybe the golden bow, but I don't know. It's a good question because I've read the phrase a million times in so many things. I've even read it in the Missalette.
Doesn't seem like something that would fit.
Well, I mean, I think it is true that All Hallows Tide, Halloween, All Saints, All Souls, is a time when and certainly the whole month of the Holy Souls, is a time when we feel closer to the dead than normally. It's the month of the Holy Souls in a lot of places as different as Estonia and Old French Canada. The month of the souls was considered a time when the dead would come back, and Mexico as well, when the dead would come back and visit the living, possibly, if God so willed. So it's not, again, our ancestors were fascinated by the turning of the year. They really, really were. There's a poem by Robert Herrick called "Ceremony Upon Candlemas Eve." And he talks about the taking down of the Christmas decorations on Candlemas Eve, and how they talks about all the other kinds of plants that go up during the course of the year. And it's a wonderful poem. And then he ends by saying, "And thus new things succeed the old." That turning of the year is a fascinating theme for them. Of course, he has another poem called "Ceremony," singular, upon Candlemas Eve. And that's very short. And he just warns the maid that if they don't take away every single Christmas decoration, so many demons will they see.
That's scary.
No, not demons. So many goblins will they see.
Oh, goblins. Well, it's still
It's still not fun.
Yeah.
I'd rather see a goblin than a demon.
It reminds me of that movie. I haven't thought of that movie in a long time. That Goblin movie in the late 80s. Goblins? Remember that movie?
Gremlins.
Oh, Gremlins. Yeah, that's right. It's been so long. Yeah, those
No,
are
I remember
nasty little things.
Gremlins. I remember Gremlins very well.
Yeah.
And I remember the second one, Gremlins 2, I saw.
What was the deal with the cute gremlin? Why was there a cute gremlin?
Well, because it wasn't a gremlin. The thing was, it was a cute little animal and a very sweet pet. The only problem was you must never feed it after midnight.
Otherwise,
It would give birth to a horde of these horrible, nasty creatures,
that's weird.
which it did.
That
Which
is-
it did. And when the guy was given the thing in the beginning, he was told, and whatever you do, don't feed it after midnight. And of course, the original survived. You know, it doesn't die in the birth. And it was just as sweet and loving and cute. And it was horrified by its offspring.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So, gratuitous plug for Patreon. We've got several different tiers of patrons. We've got the gardeners, the custodial crew, the secretarial pool, the mailroom clerks, and lastly, the top floor executives.
And if you get into the top four executives, you get to use the prestigious executive dining room, which even I don't get to go into.
That's true. But, really, it's one big happy family. We gather around the tables. We share the meals together. Delicious fish, some laughs.
Yes.
It's good times.
I've never noticed you eating the mackerel. On those few occasions when you deign to share yourself with the commissary, it's always on Monday.
Well, look, I work very hard, so I take a late and quick lunch, and by the time I'm there, all the fish is put away. So
Yeah, I'll say it's put away. Too bad it's isn't preserved. But no, I can't complain too much because I'm paid not to. But I will say that we do have these several different levels of patronage, and really, ladies and gentlemen, first and foremost, don't take us the wrong way. If you never become a patron, we love you anyway. But if you do become a patron, you become a part of this adventure in an extraordinary way. And I'll have you know that operators are standing by to take your calls. This offer is void where prohibited.
Act now. But wait, there's more. We just did an hour and 15-minute patron-only segment on movies, old-timey movies for new generations. And we had a lot of fun, and we read all the comments the patrons sent and their suggestions. And so hour and 15 minutes for that. And we did, I think, around a 45-minute pre-show. So just alone this week, you're getting 2 hours of exclusive content.
2 hours of exclusive content?
That's right, Charles. Now,
and if you order now, you don't have to spend the $25 on shipping and handling.
Well, that's actually true. You don't have.
Yeah, that's true.
There's no shipping and handling.
No shipping and handling. No CODs. I'll tell you, ladies and gentlemen, it's a joke that never gets old, because as long as you've grown up watching late night TV, you've heard this stuff.
Okay. Questions.
Do we have any memes of production?
No memes. No memes to nationalize. Sorry, everyone.
So the common good suffers again. That's fine. It always suffers.
It always suffers. I mean, I'm only one person, Charles. What can one person do in the grand scheme of things?
There's that. That's what Bogey asked Ingrid Bergman in Casablanca. Well, actually, he asserted it. He said, "This crazy world, the problems of two people." Well, never mind. What's our question? Our first question.
Okay. First question is from Ross.
Okay.
Charles, I am Church of Scotland. However, I spend most of my time debating and discussing current affairs in the company of Catholics. When I'm not told directly, I certainly often feel there's a fair level of vitriol towards people of my denomination from devout Catholics, even when we share the same views concerning monarchy, history, and politics. Why do so many trad Catholics actively choose to be so condescending and nose in the air towards those of slightly different Christian backgrounds? Does this perhaps speak to some of the reason why the Catholic faith, at least on the outside, appears to be so divided and unable to press forward in a unified sense?
Well, firstly, let me apologize on behalf of my co-religionists to any slights you may have received. But now I'll explain to you why you've gotten them, and why it's particularly difficult with your being in the Church of Scotland. The reason is simple. In the British Isles, Catholics are a bit like the American Indians here, or rather there in the United States, in the sense that ours was the old religion, and it was displaced. We were defeated. We had 2 centuries of the penal laws. We lost everything. And everywhere we go, we are reminded constantly of being the losers. You can't go, take Edinburgh, St. Giles Cathedral. That was a Catholic church. You take any of the oldest churches in Scotland or England or Ireland, they're all in Protestant hands, and they were ours. And in Scotland, in particular, they were denuded of their contents in nasty, nasty ways. I'd invite you to study the life of St. John Ogilvie, who was the only canonized Scots martyr thus far of the Reformation, so-called. The other thing you've got to know is that the founder of the Church of Scotland, John Knox, is a particularly offensive character for us because he was the architect of the downfall and then the murder of Mary Queen of Scots, who, for many of us Catholics, is something of a heroine. So that's all there in the background. And also bear in mind that in Britain especially, although most of the inhibitions against us have been gradually lifted, still can't be king. The king could be a Hindu, but he couldn't be a Catholic. So that's why. And of course the Church of Scotland is the established Church of Scotland. Now, as you know, the Queen, although not the head of the Church of Scotland, the same way that she's the head of the Church of England, is nevertheless the major layperson in the Church of Scotland. So Her Majesty and the members of the royal family are Anglicans south of the border and Presbyterians north of the border. Now, to the Catholic mind, that just seems utterly mad. And part and parcel of what we see as the basically corrosive ethos of Protestantism in general. Also, as I say, we're constantly reminded of the history of the thing. I'll give you an example of myself with my nose in the air, and you'll understand what I mean. Until the 19th century, at Christmas, the Pope would bless a crown and a sword, which he would send to a deserving Catholic soldier. Sometimes the soldier would be in Rome. Often it would be a king or something that would have to send it to him. Well, it so happened that Pope Alexander VI gave James IV this particular gift. And as a result, the sword that he blessed at Christmas and gave James IV was incorporated into the Scottish crown jewels, and it's now the sword of state. And the scabbard still has the tiara and keys on it. And it's been used at every Scots coronation down to Charles I. All right. So the Honors of Scotland, as they're called, are on exhibit at Edinburgh Castle. And I went there with a friend of mine, an Irish friend named Rory O'Hanlon, from County Monaghan, where O'Hanlons tend to come from. And we went to go see it. Well, There was a line of people in front of us, and this one Scotsman right in front of me looked at the sword of state, and he saw the papal tiara and keys on the scabbard, and he made the most disgusted look. And he said, "What's that there for, then?" And I said, ever helpful, I believe I can answer that question, sir. And I said, "You see, before John Knox sold your country to the English, this was a Catholic nation. That was a gift of the Pope to James IV." So he didn't look very happy, and he went off. And afterwards, Rory looks at me and says, "You really know how to make friends up here." I said, "Well." Then that same day, we went to Holyrood. And Holyrood, of course, for those who don't know, was the longtime residence of Scottish kings and remains the Edinburgh residence of Her Majesty. Well, there was a painting on the tour of Her Majesty after her coronation in England, basically confronted with the honours of Scotland at St. Giles Cathedral as a sort of inauguration rite of some kind. And the group were looking at this, and one person, and it was noted that she was wearing sort of a nice blue dress, but nothing official. And someone asked about that. And the tour guide, she was very good, she said, "Well, there was some mention of this at the time, that the ceremony was so much less formal than what happened in Westminster Abbey." And one Scotsman said, "Why don't we have our own coronation then?" And the tour guide said, "I don't really know." And I said, "I believe I can answer that question." And at this point, Rory, really wanted to hide his head in shame, but he didn't. He was a good sport about it. And I said, "You've got to understand that unlike Anglican or Catholic theology, Calvinist theology has absolutely no room for a sacramental rite like the coronation. It just doesn't make any sense. You can't have a bishop in the Church of Scotland today. And you certainly wouldn't have anointing, because it simply doesn't square with Calvinist theology at all. The whole concept isn't there." So I said, "That's why." And I got a lot of unpleasant looks, I don't mind telling you. But it was true, and they knew it was true, and nobody could say anything. So, to answer your question, Catholics are people too, and they tend to react the way people do. As far as regards the last element of the question, you've got to bear in mind that since the Vatican Council, there has been an enormous fight within the Church amongst, for want of a better word, I could call a Protestantizing element and an anti-Protestantizing element. And as is often the case, the anti-Protestantizing element, especially because they, apart from Pope Benedict the 16th and some people like that, at the moment are not the majority of the leadership. Its members are very much like damaged kids. When I lived through the Great Revolution, you see, and it wasn't pleasant. And had I not had a French-Canadian father with a World War II sense of humor, I probably would be quite as bitter as any bitter old trad can be. But it didn't happen that way. So, Ross, I can tell you again, I'm very, very sorry that you've been put in that position. But again, it's a bit like, as I say, it's like our own American Indians. They have kind of a chip on their shoulder. But if you examine the history, it's not entirely unwarranted.
All right, 3 questions from Garrett. Hi, Charles. Recently, I was reading a Wikipedia page on the American Solidarity Party. You were listed among the notable members. What is the ASP? How strong is it numerically? Are there any ASP members currently in office or running for office?
Well, it is true that I am a member. I don't know about notable, but I am a member. What is the American Solidarity Party? Well, the American Solidarity Party is basically an American Christian Democratic Party, is the best way I can put it. The goal is to try to put the church's social teaching into effect to some degree anyway here in the United States. I really don't know how big it is. It certainly isn't huge, but it's what's the word? All over the place. And we are, in fact, mounting an effort for this coming presidential election. Brian Carroll is the party's standard carrier this time. So he, basically the idea is that the Democrats and the Republicans, neither of them, for their own reasons, have any interest in Catholic social teaching, and except sometimes to get votes. But they have no interest in really putting it in. So the idea is that perhaps by providing a third alternative, if nothing else, we can get those ideas out amongst the general public. And lest anyone say that I'm dooming Trump if I vote American Solidarity Party, bear in mind that my vote is from California. It doesn't matter how I vote.
If we lose by one vote, you're going to hear it from me.
It won't happen. California will not be lost by one vote.
Better not be.
It won't be. It'll be lost by 2. Gavin Newsom's ex-wife being the other one.
Who, Kimberly Guilfoyle?
Yeah.
I'm going to zip my mouth because that is so weird. Because she's conservative and he's him. Okay. Anyhow, I'm not gonna talk about that. Okay, what I'm gonna talk about is, so we're talking about political parties. We're talking about a third party. Are the Republican and Democrat parties eternal constants? Do you think they'll always be that way, or do you think there will be some change? Because there have been more significant parties involved in the history of the United States, right? I mean, there's sort of a shifting landscape, right?
Well, so far, the Democratic Party have been a constant from the very beginning. The other party is what's changed.
Interesting.
So in the beginning, you had the Federalists. And then the Federalists basically broke up and were absorbed into the Democrats. So you had a period, literally, of one-party rule in the 1820s, but it was called the era of good feeling. But Andrew Jackson kind of broke that up. He was very, very controversial. And so his opponents became the Whig Party. And the Whigs kept going until the 1850s, when the slavery issue broke them up. And out of the ruins of the Whigs came the Republican Party, with some abolitionist groups. Now, the makeup of the party has varied of both parties has varied tremendously. So, for instance, after the American Civil War, the Second Civil War, the Democratic Party was dismissed by the Republicans as the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion. Now, what that meant, now, of course, if that's what the Democratic Party were for now, I'd certainly be in favor of them. But it was called that because the Democrats, firstly, were anti-prohibition, which was already becoming a thing in the 1890s, and the prohibitionists were Republican. They were called Romanist because a lot of the Irish were Democrats, and a lot of the Catholics. But that wasn't always true on a local level. So in New England, for instance, the Democrats were run by the Irish, so the French Canadians and the Italians tended to be Republican. And that was it's actually why I was Republican for such a long period of my life, because my dad was. Why was my dad? Well, his father was. They were French Canadian. It was tribal. And the Democrats were the party of the Irish, which meant the party of the Kennedys. So you wouldn't even think of voting for them. But before then, the other Republicans were the Brahmins and the Yankees, and there were ever fewer of them, so they mattered less and less. At any rate, so you had Romanism, and then rebellion referred to the fact that the Democratic Party were considered soft on the Civil War and on destroying the South. And indeed, after the Southern whites regained the franchise, they voted Democratic. The Solid South, it was called. Blacks, up until FDR, tended to be Republican because it was the party of Lincoln. Well, then, Protestants varied. Episcopalians, at the time we're speaking of, were always Republican. And there was a joke that the Episcopal Church was the Republican Party at prayer. But what happens? Well, first you've got FDR and the revolution that FDR brought about. What's the word? FDR, firstly, he brought in the black vote from the Democrats to the Democrats. He began siphoning off the Episcopalians and so on. I know, whenever you talk about Episcopalians, it gets dull. It's all right. And he basically put together what was called the New Deal Coalition. And what that meant in the 50s was you had the Kennedys allied with pro-segregation Democrats. And that was a weird deal. And they were the majority party into the 70s. But then a couple of things happened. One was that the Southerners, when the Democrats embraced civil rights for the blacks, Southerners left the party in droves and became Republican. And that was the end of the Solid South. And a lot of Catholics, though by no means the majority and certainly not the hierarchy, left the Democratic Party over abortion and moral issues. So the other thing that happened also is that the Democrats in the 19th century, the Democrats were the party of decentralization, states' rights. The Republicans were the party of big government and a strong union. But after World War II, this switched. After the New Deal, this switched. And then the Republicans became the party of small government and so forth. The Republicans under President Roosevelt were the party of non-intervention and not fighting overseas and isolationism. And the Democrats were the party of intervening all over the place. But that changed because of communism. And so now the Republicans were interested in intervening overseas to stop the spread of communism. And the Democrats became isolationists. So, I mean, it's been this kind of thing. So the reason I think why the two-party system lasted so long is simply because the two parties were so elastic that there was really no need to form a new party.
They weren't rigid. They
weren't really ideological so much as they were about getting elected. So all that mattered was getting elected. That's why they had no fixed principles. And why should they? What politician ever benefited from having fixed principles, I ask you?
Very much reminds me of one of the Tumblr House's books, The End of Democracy, Christophe Lafond de Cheval.
Was that a plug?
That it was a plug because it's an incredible book, and he says the same thing. You guys are in lockstep.
That's true.
Because you don't want to say no to people. You want to get elected. Being rigid and saying no to people causes you to lose elections.
And if you're a politician, that's what you do. You win elections. You don't lose them if you're successful.
So it sounds like you're saying that this is going to continue into the foreseeable future because the two parties are just so elastic.
Well, not necessarily. Because we're going into ground right now. What's happened is that you're in a position where the Republicans represent a huge chunk, perhaps even a majority, and by the Republicans now I'm speaking of Trump, of the actual population of the United States. But the Democrats, in all their extremity, nevertheless represent the ruling elite. And you're getting into a spot now where, I mean, in days gone by, our elites were divided into two groups or more, and the party system reflected that. Now, there's virtually no section of the elite that believes what a majority of the population believes. And now, as a result, you're getting into a very strange position that America has never been in before, which is the notion of the governed against the state. Remember the whole myth that we've always cultivated of self-government, of consent to the governed, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That was plausible so long as at least one segment of the elites, somehow or other, reflected their subjects. But none of them do. Not anymore. Not anymore. I mean, and see, the problem with that is that you're looking at a setup where the system itself could possibly break down in a way it's never done before.
What does that mean?
Well, I mean, it means anarchy. It means the center not holding. It means every man for himself, and then survival of the fittest. And then finally the rise of a strong man who'll set everything to rights, quote unquote.
Is there a historical precedent for this dynamic that you talked about in terms of the rulers and the ruled being opposite?
Well, yeah, I mean, a good example is the Spanish Civil War. I mean, the Spanish Second Republic, you know, the reason why Franco succeeded was because he was able to appeal to a solid majority of the Spanish people. And he had the army behind him, but that would not have been enough. The Second Republic had called, basically, they had a lot of supporters, but they had basically cut themselves off from Spain. And they were getting crazier and crazier.
You know, it just occurred to me, there's such a strange paradox because you went through the history of the two parties, and the moral of the story is the two parties are incredibly elastic.
They were.
Yeah, and yet, they were, okay. Because now,
for things to pursue their normal course, what you would need at this point is for a Democrat to arise, maybe even be nominated as president, who basically stole Trump's thunder.
How can that happen? That doesn't seem real.
Well, it doesn't seem real because you forget what Democrats were like. They weren't always crazy. I mean, even in our time, we had the Irishman from Pennsylvania. He was a very famous pro-life Democrat. He was governor.
But if someone had those qualities, why would they be Democrat now?
Well, see, that is my point exactly. In days gone by, you generally saw the same weird mix of things in both parties. They weren't so far apart, and they were constantly changing. But ever since the 60s, the 70s, certainly since abortion, we have been going on this road where the Democrats have become ever more radical and crazy, and the Republicans have basically sucked up everybody who thinks that's wrong.
It's true.
And so the way the Democrats have kept up their numbers is by promises and by goodies. But there's a limit to what you can do with that. And now, one of the interesting things is that Marxist analysis in our country has changed a great deal. And don't kid yourself, an awful lot of our Democratic and other folk like Antifa and BLM leadership are Marxists. But classical Marxism no longer makes any sense in the United States. Why is that? Well, it's because there's no longer a proletariat the way there was. No large group, I should say, in the United States, except the homeless, no large group is really in a position to feel excluded on the basis of class, because everybody's standard of living is sufficiently comfortable. You don't have the sweatshops. You don't have the old factories, the smokestacks. We don't have that anymore. So the only people that Marxism could appeal to as foot soldiers were those disaffected proletarians. Well, they're not there. So Marxist analysis has switched from class to race. And that's why they're playing the race card. But the problem in doing that is severalfold. Firstly, when you're trying to attack people on the basis not of what they have, but who they are, you're going to get much worse opposition, number one. Number two, the industrial proletariat was a much larger proportion of the population and much more necessary in a sense. That is to say, they were occupying. I mean, if the wheels of industry and commerce stopped, the country would be in a terrible way. But by putting it all on a relatively small group of racial minorities and trying to use them as a battering ram to take power, you may smash the structure, but you'll never take control of it. And out of the ruins you make, another force will arise. And that other force will probably be very unpleasant.
Okay.
I made the joke, when asked what an American strongman would be like, our version of Franco, if you will. I said, I can't tell, because it'll all depend on the circumstances, and above all, on his particular personality. If he's really into tulips and roses, we'll all find an interest in flowers we never had before.
Remembering a Facebook post you had on this, you gave him a couple qualities. You said, one, he's going to wrap himself in the flag.
Yeah.
What was the other one?
Oh, he'll probably hold some version of the cross as well.
Ah. Yeah.
The cross and the flag.
Okay.
And to the degree, the more malevolent he is, the more painful it will be to watch those symbols being used. Now, the less malevolent he is, the less bothersome it'll be. But I mean, again, and he could be anything from Franco to Hitler. If we're lucky, it'll be Franco. If we're not so lucky, and Franco was a genius at uniting all the disparate elements of the Spanish right, which were very, very divided, and getting them all to pull together sufficiently to defeat the communists. So.
Okay. Another question from Garrett. Are there any historical examples of counter-revolutions that were successful? If so, what were their modes of operation? Are there any lessons to be learned?
Now, I just touched on Franco. He was a pretty good example, even though, strictly speaking, he was a revolutionary, but he was revolting against a revolutionary regime. So that's a counter-revolution. And the lessons to be learned are severalfold. Firstly, one learns a lot from the many unsuccessful counter-revolutions. Why did they fail? Well, they failed because basically they were made up. Number one, they were made up of very disparate groups whose only common thing was whose only common thing was a shared hatred of the revolution.
Okay.
That was it. So that was all they had in common. So my mind is going. Yeah, so that was the only thing they had in common. And so what would happen is they would often fight each other almost as much as they fought the enemy. The other thing was that they did not have the same ruthlessness that the revolutionaries had. Well, Franco was able to overcome the differences of the various groups, and he sure had that ruthlessness. You bet. So he won. The difficulty again is that for a counter-revolution to succeed, the counter-revolutionaries have to be even more dedicated to the cause than the revolutionaries. And they have to be willing to work with other people who differ from them in greater or lesser ways.
Wow, sounds like we're not even close. Because we fragment so easily, and it's hard to get anyone off the couch to even...
That's where the strong man will come along, and he'll get us off the couch, I promise.
How? How does one do that? What's the secret formula here?
The bayonet.
What?
The bayonet. You get drafted into the army, and off you go. A strong man won't be nice. And if he needs troops, he'll get troops.
Forced conscription.
Oh, yeah.
Wow. Well, we're in a place now it's hard to believe we're at, but it's become normal, so maybe that's likewise.
I hope not. I'm making these predictions, ladies and gentlemen, but you have no idea how much I hope I'm wrong. And if on my 70th birthday in 10 years, everything I've said has not come true, I will be the happiest kid on the block.
Okay. Well, changing tone, Garrett has one final question.
Good.
Being a Californian, what are your thoughts on the marijuana topic? Is it morally acceptable?
Dude. I mean, it's like, you got a real sweet tube with these resins, And no, well, firstly, let me say, and I'm quite serious about this, I have never smoked pot in my life. Now, I say this because I promised my dad I wouldn't, and I didn't. I kept the promise. Now, I was several times in rooms that were filled with pot smokers. And when I was young, I didn't really care one way or the other. I had no opinion on the issue. But as I've gotten older and seen what has become of the friends of mine who were kind of heavy potheads, my views have changed. I don't really think it's a good idea. I really don't. People say that, it's like tobacco and booze. No, it's not. No, it's not. So I'm really, on the one hand, I'm not really keen on it being decriminalized. But on the other, I think it's very funny how once it was decriminalized in California, on all the conservative talk shows, You had all these ads to get into the burgeoning pot industry and invest and really clean up. I thought that showed a real dedication to principle.
Has anything in American politics ever been dedicated to principle or just getting votes?
What a question. Are you even a patriot? Of course it's always about principle. Didn't you ever watch Schoolhouse Rock? This country is about freedom. It's about liberty. It's the shining city on the hill, the last best hope of mankind. We got so much principle, we ooze it.
I mean, I'm
to
sure
answer your
there are
question.
exceptions. I'm sure there are exceptional people, men of principle, who are the
Yeah.
exception to the rule. But okay, what?
There are, but to be honest with you, all joking aside, this is a question that's been the case ever since the beginning. As early as Alexander Hamilton, you had people complaining that principle simply wasn't involved. There's a book I recommend highly called The Education of Henry Adams by a man called Henry Adams, who was the great-great-grandson of John Adams, the grandson of John Quincy Adams. Then he talks about this in great detail, about how principle didn't really mean all that much. And then de Tocqueville, of course, Alexander de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, is another good book to read. The thing is that the anything for votes syndrome has always been present, but from time to time there have been counterbalancing forces. At the moment, there doesn't seem to be.
I see. I mean, I asked that question because there are things that stick out at you, and quotes that jump out at me. I mean, you've got Abraham Lincoln saying, "If I could preserve the Union without freeing the Negro, I would do so." You've got what's his face? Not FDR, LBJ, saying, "We're going to get these Negroes voting for us for the next 100 years." So it seems like that whole area of civil rights is just chasing after political expedience or expedience in the war.
Well, yeah, and of course one of the sad things for the blacks in this country is that I've said it before, I'll say it again. They were brought in voluntarily in the first place. Although some of them, like Phyllis Wheatley, our first published black poet, saw a providential thing for them in that. Nevertheless, they were brought here involuntarily, sold back in Africa by other blacks. They were the laborers here. They built up the South and other places. When they were freed, they had nothing to do with it. They were freed because of a war between white men. Jim Crow Reconstruction, of course, they were given power, but not really. They were used. And then they paid the price for being used with Jim Crow. And of course, the civil rights movement itself could never have been successful had it not been for white people joining it, and for an appeal to the conscience of white America. So, with the exception of the period during Jim Crow, when they built up all these wonderful institutions of education, commerce, religion, apart from that, they have never really had the opportunity or the chance to build anything on their own. And that, that is not going to, as I say, the one extraordinary exception was what they did for themselves under Jim Crow, which you can't take away from them. You think of, well, of course, you think of the 6 blacks who were in the running for statehood right now, 6 black Americans. You think of George Washington Carver and the Tuskegee Institute. Or not George Washington, sorry, he was a great scientist, Booker T. Washington, the Tuskegee Institute. You think of the Tuskegee Airmen, the Buffalo Soldiers on the frontier. It's not as though they don't have a record of accomplishment. They do, which very few people, including themselves, tend to know about. But by and large, the black community have never been in a position to make their own decisions for themselves in anything major. Margaret Sanger slated them for destruction, and now most of their politicians are in the back pocket of Planned Parenthood.
Okay. I asked you a question about the future of the two-party system. What about the future of the black community in terms of how they vote? Is the Democratic Party going to continually have this stranglehold on their community, or is it sort of breaking? Because it seems that we see more and more black politicians, black political figures. I mean, Tim Scott, Candace Owens, Terrence Williams on Twitter, who's kind of a comedian, all sorts of, black people now. Is it breaking? Is the stranglehold breaking?
I hope so. I hope so for their sake, because, the truth of the matter is, and see, again, if it does, that will be, if the blacks are able to break the stranglehold the Democrats have on them that LBJ boasted about. Can you imagine boasting about using them? If they could break that stranglehold and make their own decisions as to what's right and wrong as opposed to some kind of groupthink, it will be the biggest and best thing that has happened for them since all of the things I spoke about under Jim Crow.
Well, absolutely. The governing quote that I always remember is from Stephen A. Smith, who says that black people have marginalized themselves because you got one party that knows that they got you in their pocket.
Oh, they don't care.
And the other party knows that they're not going to get you ever. So neither party needs to actually vie for the black community because everything's set in stone.
Yep. And if the black community themselves break that,
more power to them. That would be great.
More power to them, indeed. Well, I do too. It'll be, believe me, it's a lot better idea than NFAC heading back to Liberia.
Yeah, you talked about that on the I think the movie episode.
I did.
Today. Yeah.
But it's a very important thing. Setting aside everything else and putting, of course, those 6 holy blacks at the height of it all. The truth is that the black American has contributed an awful lot to this country. And we simply would not be the same place without them. Yeah. And, I'm sorry if that offends anybody, just as I'm sorry if I offend anyone when I speak about the importance of European culture and I attack the anti-whiteness stuff. Well, truth is truth, whoever it offends. And I
A question from Philip the Good of Burgundy.
Duke.
I was converted to the faith by many things that are all related in some way. History, literature, etc. Am I correct in saying that the things that helped us convert are what we are supposed to use to convert others in our lives?
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone who comes into the faith is drawn to it by different things. But obviously, you yourself will be drawn into it. What drew you into it will draw in like-minded people. So, for instance, if you read yourself into the church because you discovered Belloc or Chesterton, Tolkien, whomever you like, there's a good chance that some of the other people who like these guys, or would like them if they were exposed to them, will go the same way you did, especially if you introduce them to them. But there are all sorts of reasons people come into the church. For some people, it's the liturgy. They fall in love with it. Some it's the music, some it's the artwork, some it's the literature, some it's history. But whatever brought you in will bring others in.
The number one reason why people convert to the Catholic faith, the Eucharist. People want the body of Christ. I thought that's interesting.
Let that be a lesson to you, all the bishops who are keeping us from Mass.
Yeah, we're hungry. All right, question from Jonathan Taylor. A really good question. I recently visited the statue of Marquis de Lafayette in LaGrange, Georgia. My question for Charles is, if America became a Catholic country, should these statues of men who promoted the ideals of the French Revolution be taken down?
No. No, they're a part of our history. We should remember the way we were, and of course, would give one a good opportunity to teach about Lafayette and what was wrong with his stance and so forth. Okay. I'm not a great one for knocking down statues. I might make an exception for the statue of Lenin in Seattle.
Is there really a statue of Lenin in Seattle?
Yeah. Too much bud, too much coffee, too much fog. Addles the brain a little bit. Hence, chop chop.
What the hell is the matter with these people?
They are products of an educational system that was designed to cut them off from reality and succeeded beyond their wildest dreams.
We're all... Okay. Calm down. Breathe. Next question.
Also, if you're smoking weed and drinking coffee and listening to Kurt Cobain, things look different. It smells like Teen Spirit.
Oh gosh, that's so...
What?
Oh man, you're desperate. That's what you are.
What do you mean I'm
desperate? I
what?
mean, it's like, okay, all right, Seattle pop culture references, let's go. Okay, yeah, Kurt Cobain. Oh, what's the big song from Nirvana? Oh, Smells Like Teen Spirit. Got it.
Yeah. What do you mean I'm desperate?
Your pop culture references are desperate.
No, they're not. They're appropriate, and it broke you up, which is the whole point. You lost it, and that's all I can ask for.
All right.
You may hold the whip hand as the high and mighty chairman of the corporation. The only weapon I have to fight your dominance with are pop culture references.
That's actually true. Okay.
I know it's true. That's why I'm doing it. That's why it smells like Teen Spirit. By the way, Kurt Cobain did not kill himself. He was murdered.
What?
Kurt Cobain did not commit suicide. He was murdered.
That is fake news.
Everybody knows it.
Okay, you're done. You're done.
What do you mean I'm done?
You're done. Next question.
You don't want to hear about the Cobain conspiracy? Not
from you, no. All right.
This is important information.
Is it, though?
It is. It definitely is. You ever heard of oh golly, what was his name? Zapruder, the fellow with the photograph at the Kennedy assassination?
No.
Yes, well, he was nowhere around when Cobain was murdered. Coincidence? I think not.
What, if he's supposed to be everywhere, or what?
Obviously, you don't know how these things work, do you?
Obviously.
Was there a congressional investigation into Cobain's murder? No. Why was there a cover-up? That's what I want to know.
Wow, you've actually kind of have this prepackaged. You have this sort of joke mapped out beforehand, don't you?
No, I'm actually making it up as we're going
So-
along right now.
Wow, that's impressive, actually.
Well,
Okay.
thank you. That's why I get the big bucks.
All right. Next question from Christian. The elephant in the room of modern Catholicism is that we've, according to traditionalists, had the church self-destruct since Vatican II, theologically get overrun with predators, had popes teaching utterly un-Catholic things, adding up to a solid 60 to 70 years of bad magisterium. How can one appeal to the Catholic faith when the church is said to be indefectible, and yet on average utterly corrupt and borderline heretical at an ecumenical council, and for the 60 years since that council? Everything about Catholicism makes sense historically, theologically, and scripturally, until Vatican II and its aftermath, which stands as a gaping rebuke of the Church's claim to indefectibility. As a faithful Catholic, I ask for some explaining of how the faith can be true amidst all of this.
I have one immediate answer, and in 2 words: Eucharistic miracles. Now, why do I say that? Well, we've had 6 of them in the past 25 years. They've been very carefully examined, and they are all weird. And they involve the turning of Eucharistic bread to actual flesh, and the turning of Eucharistic wine to actual blood.
Including in the Novus Ordo as well.
They were all in the Novus Ordo.
Oh, they were all in the Novus Ordo. Oh.
All the ones in the past 25 years were in the Novus Ordo.
Wow.
Now, what does that tell us? What it tells us is that transubstantiation is a real thing. Now, if transubstantiation is true, which is the most unbelievable dogma we've got, I mean, the Trinity, the Incarnation, those things are hard to wrap your head around. But the idea that this bread and wine that normally do not change appearance are somehow actually the body and blood of Christ, that's got to be the hardest thing we got going. And yet, these miraculous occurrences would suggest that the church's teaching here is absolutely true. So that's the first place you got to start. Christ really comes down on the altar every day with the Catholics, with the Orthodox, the Armenians and Ethiopians and Syriacs and Assyrians and so forth. Now, from there, then, we have to assume, oh, okay, the craziest of Catholic doctrines is literally true. Everything else, then, has to be seen in its relationship to that. And if we go back and we look not just at the Arian heresy, which is everyone's favorite simile, but also the Great Schism when we had 3 popes, the Pornocracy when we had over a century of the church being ruled by sluts, for want of a better word. Each of these were different. Some of them involved doctrinal issues, some did not. But all of them would have appeared to have shattered the church's claim to indefectibility, except that the church survived them all. Not that she survived them, but you'll notice that with almost every one of them, there was a miraculous event that occurred, sometimes to the very worst of popes. So, for example, Pope Liberius, who was the one who signed the Semi-Arian Creed, he was also the one under whose reign the miracle of Our Lady of the Snows occurred, and the Liberian Basilica in Rome was built, St. Mary Major. The Pornocracy, John the 12th is my favorite bad pope, the one who was murdered by his girlfriend's husband, who I've often wondered, did that guy go to heaven for defending the marriage bond or hell for killing the pope?
If I'm not mistaken, John the 12th was himself the son of a pope.
He was. It was during the Pornocracy mistakes were made. So it went into the family business, as you might say. Yet, he confirmed the Charter of Cluny, thus unwittingly, eventually, laying the foundation for a reform in the church. John the 22nd, who taught that the just will not see God until the general judgment, and imprisoned those who disagreed with him, although he recanted on his deathbed. He was the one to whom Our Lady delivered the Sabbatine privilege on the scapular. So what does all this kind of stuff mean? It means that there's a mystery about the church, just as there's a mystery about the Eucharist. And what we think we see from our limited, trapped in the present standpoint is not all there is. I'll admit to you, it's not fun. It's not enjoyable. But I always think of Gandalf in Lord of the Rings, the ever quoted quote. Frodo says, "Oh, I wish this hadn't happened in my time." And Gandalf says, "So say you, so say I. So says everyone who lives in such times. But it's not given to us to choose what time we shall live in. All that is given to us is to choose what we shall do with the time we are given."
Yeah. I think in 100 years, 200 years, people will be able to look at this post-Vatican II time with the same sort of dispassion that we currently are able to look at the Arian heresy, the Reformation, the pornocracy. And not to say that we don't care, but it doesn't engage the emotions, our emotions in the same way.
Well, we don't have the story worked out.
Right.
Our problem is we don't know how this story is going to work out.
Right.
But Christ says, just as he said to Peter in the boat, Christ says, "Don't be afraid. I'm here. I'm coming down to the altar for you." He continues to come. So we're getting all excited. We're bent out of shape. And mind you, sometimes there are reasons to be bent out of shape.
Yeah.
But what we can't do is despair. There will be a solution, even if we can't see it. Just as many of the generations of Catholics before us lived through similar times and had no idea how the story was going to play out. It will. And that is the indefectibility, in case you're curious.
All right, next question is from Laramie. Israel and several African countries have opened themselves to the idea of the right of return. Do you think any European countries will ever follow suit and allow their nation's estranged descendants abroad back to their old homelands? Do you think South Africans will ever be allowed to return to their European countries? Do you think countries like Hungary or Poland would let Catholics move in simply based on the proposition that they are Catholic faithful?
It all depends on how badly they need people and how badly they need numbers. No, really. I mean, you take the Japanese, for example. Back in the 20s and 30s, when Japan had a big growth rate, a lot of Japanese emigrated to Brazil and set up these big agricultural colonies in Brazil. Well, the past 20 years or so, because of the severe decline in the Japanese birth rate and their intense dislike of every other nationality, they've invited the Brazilian Japanese to come back. And a lot of them have. But when they get back, they find that they're really not like the other Japanese. They're enough like them to be tolerated, but they're often Catholic. They speak Portuguese as well as Japanese. They have a very different outlook on life because they came from somewhere else. So they're tolerated, but they tend to live in Brazilian villages in Japan. And probably what would happen for a few generations anyway, let's say that England declared that anyone of English descent can return. Well, you'd have a lot of, or Scottish or Irish, you'd have a ton of Appalachian people go over. Well, even though a lot of the Appalachian dialect is Old English, they are very different from the people in England today. So they might find themselves like the Brazilian Japanese, getting very low-end jobs and doing all the things that regular English don't like doing. But in 2 or 3 generations, they'd be assimilated.
Okay. Alrighty. Next question is from Marianne, new patron. All right. She says, "Dear Charles and Vincent, thanks to your show, I've been inspired to join the Catholic Church."
Oh,
Wow.
Thank you. Thank you very much. God bless you, my dear. May your tribe increase.
"I was raised Protestant, but got into paganism and New Age drivel later on, looking for something magical that I never quite found in those ugly Protestant churches. On my journey, I heard the many stupid arguments pagans make, including the one where Jesus is compared to Sol Invictus, Mithra, and due to the many references to wine and grapevines, to Bacchus, as though Jesus is just a recycled myth. We all know this isn't true, but what is the reason for these older religions having similar themes? Thank you."
Well, that's a very, very good question, which I'm glad you asked. Well, there are several possible reasons, any of which may be true, or all of which may be true at once.
Okay.
Well, the one has to do with the nature of reality. God created it, and the pagans, being human, apprehended certain things. We know there are angels. Well, the pagans would have sensed their existence. How they interpreted them might have been different, but they knew they were there.
Why would the pagans have sensed their existence?
Well, because people do, and sometimes people see them. And that, they're part of reality like everything else.
Okay.
Similarly, our minds are formed in a given way. Tertullian was the first one to say the soul is naturally Christian. And so, humanly speaking, we react to things in certain ways. If we face what, I love the word, the numinous, the awe-inspiring, there's a tendency to want to perform a gesture to show respect, kneeling, or bowing, or throwing yourself on the ground, or something. Candles and incense speak to everybody of worship. The same with water that you wash in. The idea that there is something basically wrong between us and our Creator, and that somehow the sacrifice of that which we hold most dear could perhaps bridge that gap between us and that. I mean, all human beings can sense that something is off with the human condition. We all know this. We know that we die, and yet we don't want to die. It's a great mystery. These are just common themes, and our reaction to them is common. Now, that's one very great possibility. And of course, again, we're so constructed that we are made to receive the truth and to believe the truth when we hear it. Our fallen nature often leads us to rebel against it, but nevertheless, it's there. And if we encounter something that's even partially true, we sometimes glom onto it. Now, that's one possibility. The other thing to be borne in mind is the original revelation given our first parents, Adam and Eve. That revelation was passed on to their descendants and was pure in some places and more corrupt in others. One of the things I should have mentioned that's universal is the desire to mark the turning of the seasons and to celebrate the solstices and the equinoxes and all that, to mark the turning of the year.
Okay.
But then, as I say, there's the possibility of the original revelation first given to Adam and Eve, and then the second one given to Moses. Now, that first revelation, as I say, became more or less corrupt, but much less amongst the children of Abraham. than anybody else. So what are the things that we may deduce from it? The triune nature of God, which is something that reappears in religion after religion after religion. Now, the idea of a God born of a virgin who dies and rises again, that could be both, or either. The one a prophecy, the other an inborn expectation that's expressed through myth and so on.
Okay. Alrighty. Our last question today is from Daniel.
All right.
Why did Christ offer little in political or economic ideas?
Because what he was already offering was so radical, it would change the mind of the believer. And once changed, the believer would be able to look on everything with new sight and come up with better solutions than we'd had before. And that happened. You know, the Christian world, the early Christian world, was much different and much better off in everything from slavery to the position of women than the pagan world. The taking the position of women, for instance, the role of the Blessed Virgin Mary immediately elevated the role of women in human life from where Eve had left it. It just automatically, the new Eve. They, with the Blessed Virgin Mary in mind, no Catholic or Orthodox, etc., can ever look at women the way a pagan could.
It's actually true.
Yeah, it is true. And similarly, knowing that Christ was king and that God was the Lord of all, no Catholic could look at his sovereign the way a pagan does.
Wow.
It's just not possible. I mean, all of the sovereigns of antiquity claim divinity, and even today, the king of Thailand, the emperor of Japan, are leaders of their respective national religions, as are all the Muslim rulers, though they weren't pagan. And of course, in the post-Christian United States, we tend to look at the government as some sort of god. But a Catholic cannot.
Yeah, so in other words, what Jesus brought is something so basic that once you're rooted in these basic foundational ideas, a moral, political, economic systems will
arise naturally.
Yeah,
they'll arise organically. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and its justice, and all else shall be given unto you.
I think I want to touch on a different aspect of this, which is sort of the concept of deliverance. I guess, because many of the Jews were looking for a political deliverance. Is that correct?
Yeah.
They wanted to be, they're in this tough situation and they wanted this Messiah to come and save them politically. And I think we are kind of in a similar situation where we need to make sure that we don't make the same mistake as the Jews, per se, where we're looking for political messiahs, political solutions, instead of spiritual solutions. Is that fair to say?
Well, it is, the more so because, we, as Americans, we tend to look at the ballot as the solution to everything. If we could just vote in the right man, everything will be great. But that never happens. It never works. But the same idea can also be present looking at the church, as our friend who asked about indefectibility shows. Because as long as our Lord is still coming down on the altar. Everything is different for us. And as you guys have all learned in the last few months, there's a world of difference between having access to the sacraments and not.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that, as you had pointed out, what Jesus brings is foundational. It's basic. It's spiritual. Yeah. And then the political solutions and economic solutions sort themselves out.
They do. It's important to bear in mind, of course, that the believers were part of that sorting. I mean, they didn't happen magically.
No, of course.
But so for instance, on the one hand, the Christian Roman Empire was in fact the organic successor of the pagan Roman Empire.
Right.
But oh, how different.
Right.
Because you now had a Christian emperor.
Well, what I'm getting at is there's an order of operations to transforming the world.
And the spiritual always has to come first.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
The political, I mean, even when you're doing the political thing in tandem, you've always got to bear in mind the spiritual has to come first. But this can snap back and bite you in funny ways. So, for instance, during the Cristero War, and this was a typical example of a pattern that has been going on for a very long time. You've got a situation where the church is under attack. So the hierarchy call their laity to defend the church. And they do. But then, as they're pushing forward toward victory, their opponents do an end run around to the clergy. Now, the clergy, you understand, they're not really interested. I'm talking at their best now. I'm not talking about. They're not really interested in political issues per se. They're really most interested in simply being able to do their jobs, offer communion, hear confessions, and so forth. They don't really care about anything else. Well, some of them do, but more and large they don't. So what will happen is that the opponents will say, you know what? You call off your dogs. We'll go back to where we were, and you guys can freely do your jobs again. And that's all they really want. So guess what? I can tell you 4 or 5 occasions on which defeat was snatched from the jaws of victory by the clergy ordering the laity to lay down their arms, and then the laity was slaughtered. And the Cristiada was a good example of that. Pius XI, who, in terms of his writings, was one of the very best of popes, was one of the worst of political leaders. So I mention this because we're never in a position, as history shows, to simply make a blanket comment that doesn't have to be fit to the particular situation. So, I mean, you could say, and in fact, the reason why Pius XI withdrew his backing of the Catholic parties in Germany and Italy, the reason why he did what he did with the Cruceros, did a couple of other things, is because, not because he wanted to see Mexicans die. It was because he wanted to get the church out of politics and to focus on what was called Catholic action, which would be purely spiritual. The problem was that this was not a time when that was going to work.
Interesting.
And so, instead, he ended up with a lot of dead Catholics in Europe and in Latin America.
Interesting.
Well,
where are we then? So I think I get what you're saying. So are we?
I don't know. I don't know, because you got to bear in mind, right now, as the lockdown showed us, we have no hierarchical leadership. The church leadership is not an independent voice the way it was under Pius XI. So, but that is the particular challenge of this time. And this, of course, is where prayer becomes so important. because without it, we will be the slaves of both our emotions and our intellects. As I would go so far as to say Pius XI was in this case. You know, this was a situation where not political thought, but sheer loyalty to his flock should have prevailed. An emotional thing, if you will. And this was one case where the intellect did worse than the emotions did.
It's interesting.
Well, I mean, you got to bear in mind, the economy of salvation is such that we can never afford to be smug. And we can never take whatever course of action we choose, and you have to choose something. We can never take it as the best thing that could ever have been done. In other words, we always have to admit to the fact that you and I can be wrong. And the great paradox is that at the same time we can't allow that to paralyze us.
Yeah, I was going to say, you have to...
You have to do something.
You have to make bold moves, and you have to believe in what you do.
Yeah.
So you have to believe in what you do, and yet acknowledge that you could be wrong.
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. But if you do that, you're less likely to be inhuman. Well, you know, it's the people who are absolutely sure they're completely correct in everything they do who are responsible for the deaths, the mass murders. Because they know. They're absolutely convinced. Well, good. Hope it works out for them.
Well, another long episode.
I'll say. Another long 3 episodes.
3 episodes. Charles is beat. He's worn out. So
you're not kidding. There's more of me here than I wanted. And you know, the one consolation is that I think we've made real progress tonight.
On what?
Solving the Kurt Cobain cover-up.
Oh. I didn't know you were so into it, Charles.
I wasn't until this evening. It was only when I realized that it was a conspiracy to murder Kurt Cobain that has been covered up. The proof of the pudding is that everybody talks about the Kennedy assassination. No one talks about Cobain's murder. I think he was eliminated because he knew too much.
What about Tupac? Talk to us about Tupac Shakur. Is he dead?
No, Tupac's alive. Tupac Shakur is alive and well.
Wait, okay,
he's living in Switzerland.
Shakur, please don't say Shakur.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Tupac Shakur is alive and well and living in Switzerland as a Swiss dentist named Dietrich Ulstein.
That is delightfully random.
Well, why do you think he used that cover?
He doesn't look like a Dietrich.
He does now.
All right. Any closing...
The same man who dyed Milo Yiannopoulos' hair dyed Tupac's.
Now, Tupac actually doesn't have hair.
He does now. He's got a big head of blonde hair.
That must be a sight.
Well, he's also had his skin, stained. You wouldn't recognize him. He doesn't look anything the way he did in the States.
Wow.
It had to be a complete, total change. And obviously it succeeded. Fooled everybody, and now he's safe. Because, like Kurt Cobain, he knew too much.
Yeah.
And he saw they got Cobain. He wasn't sticking around.
Okay. Any final thoughts? Any closing thoughts, Charles?
I'm afraid you're not taking those other issues very seriously.
I'm afraid not.
Oh well, better late next time, I guess. Yeah, just a couple. I was glad that our friend asked about our convert from paganism, asked about all that today, because of course it is Lammas, and the pagans have made a big deal out of Lammas, which they've tried to de-baptize it.
Oh.
Ain't gonna work, kids. Ain't gonna work. Lammas is a Christian holiday. St. Peter in chains. So, ladies and gentlemen, I do have a final thought on that basis. It is the beginning, as I've said, of the harvest season. Beginning of August, and now the year, get through this one remaining hot month, unless you're in LA, in which case it can last into November. But let's get through this. Let's get on to September, the time of celebration, that the waning of the year will start, and Halloween will come, and All Saints and All Souls and Martinmas and Veterans Day, and we have Michaelmas as well coming up in September. Thanksgiving, St. Andrew's Day for all you Scots, and then we'll get into Advent and St. Lucy's Day and Our Lady of Guadalupe, and then Christmas, ladies and gentlemen, Christmas. And Christmas Eve and Christmas Day and St. Stephen's and New Year's Day, New Year's Eve will leave bloody 2020 behind. And please God, the next year will be better. Then we'll have the Epiphany. And for those of you who are into that kind of thing, Burns Night. And then Candlemas, and finally Mardi Gras. And Valentine's Day will come in there too. St. Valentine's Day. So then the period of celebration will be over. So stay sane. And whatever your circumstances may be as these feasts come up, however little you may at the moment feel like celebrating them, do your best. Partly to honor the feast, partly to honor your own pasts, and partly to stay sane. And who knows, we may solve the Cobain Shakur mystery.
Okay.
We might.
Well, it seems like you've got the Shakur mystery solved already, Charles. You've got it pretty much mapped out. I think it's safe to say.
There's a lot I still don't know.
Oh, okay. There's a lot you still don't know. Okay, got it.
Well, yeah, because, see, what I don't know, and you could have asked me this, you didn't. I said both Cobain was killed and Shakur had to go into hiding because they knew too much. Yeah. You never asked what was it they knew.
Because I knew I wasn't going to get a coherent answer. You think I'm stupid?
No, and of course I'll give you a coherent answer. If I knew what it was they knew, then I'd be dead or in hiding.
Well, that's true, I guess. Yeah.
So I don't know what it was.
Well,
now that's a coherent answer.
Okay, fine. Fair enough, Charles.
See, you said you were going to. I did. That answer's as coherent as anything your government will tell you.
Well, that's okay. That's saying a lot.
Yeah, I give yourself a low standard, you'll always fulfill it. So, but I do have a question for you.
Yeah.
If it is off the Monday.
If it is off the menu, it's Monday.
Oh, yeah?
What about the soul you save?
It may be your own.
Good. All right,
God bless, ladies and gentlemen. See you next week.